Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I find the conference theme of envisioning a better world actually very difficult. I'm a lot more comfortable talking about the male supremacist movements and ideologies that I conduct research on because I'm mired in reading about those movements and ideologies every day. And although part of the work I do is to think about strategies for prevention and obstructing the rise of misogyny and male supremacism, nonetheless, there's not a lot of space and time for envisioning what we would want in an ideal world. And so this is definitely outside of my comfort zone. And the more that my work has focused in on looking at movements that are male supremacist and also movements that are white supremacist and anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ more broadly, my work has, I think, narrowed the kind of vision I have and the time that I spend discussing what would a better world look like beyond just pushing back the negative forces that we have today. But I think that finding a way to think positively and not just as an anti is a really important part of building the world that we want to see. And I think that that has lessons for the secular movement or atheist movement and how it conceptualizes itself as well. Because when I was active in the secular movement, I found that so much of it was formulated around being anti-religion. In the US, that meaning specifically anti the Christian right. And the kinds of issues that secular organizations decided to work on and spent their effort on were based on being against the encroachment of religion by Christian right organizations. And while pushing back on theocratic encroachments is, of course, important, as is pushing for atheist civil rights, the focus on the values that we stand for within the atheist and secular movement, not as in opposition to the issues that some other movement and some other ideology has defined for us, but in terms of our own values around social justice issues, is really important. And I remember when I came to one of the Secular Student Alliance meetings when I was still a member of the board of directors, that I had been reading as part of some coursework for my graduate program, The Radical King, which is an edited volume of works from Martin Luther King Jr., edited by Cornel West, that focus on the more radical aspects of his ideology for racial justice and economic justice. That isn't how King is often presented in the history books and in this kind of moderate mainstream version of King that is often taught today. And one of the things that really moved me about the readings in that volume is that Martin Luther King was a religious individual. He believed in heaven, but nonetheless, his work contained an urgency that this world was important and this world needed to change, and it needed to change now. And I feel like that sense of urgency, even though within the atheist or secular movement, is focused on the concept that this world is the only world that we know we have, the only life we have to live, that kind of urgency around taking action often seems to be missing. And I think that the movement is poised to potentially be something very radical, that the kind of commitments to social justice for marginalized communities that other mainstream organizations in more mainstream movements might neglect is substantial within the secular movement, and that we have a potential space to be something that is very inspiring and very radical for the good of humanity. But instead, a lot of what we've been mired in, and this has come from the leadership of cis male white leaders in particular, has often been focused on simply opposing religion for religion's sake and not the specific things about the religion that are problematic and harmful. And if you're working within social justice communities, then progressive religious traditions are often a place where you find allies, where they are pushing back against misogyny, where they are pushing back against racism, where they are pushing back against opposition to LGBTQ rights. And within the atheist movement, we've had very serious issues with misogyny, with racism. It's a movement that is very dominated by white men. And it's one in which there's even often a resistance to working on issues of social justice as not what the movement is about, that it is only about being anti-religious. And so rather than be defined by opposition to religion, instead, I want to focus on male supremacism and misogyny as an ideology that underlies both religious and secular movements. And in its secular manifestations, we've seen a significant growth in the era of the internet and social media in certain secular misogynist movements and ideologies. And ideologies that are secular in terms of how this concept is used in the mainstream and outside of what is sometimes called the organized secular movement, means that it includes individuals who both might have theistic or atheistic beliefs. And there's a noted presence of atheists in misogynist online movements like the Red Pill, which is a anti-feminist ideology that pushes teaching what they call game for men to manipulate women into sex, but amounts to endorsements of sexual violence in a lot of its writing. And in addition to that, this concept of the red pill or awakening to the truth of society is very tied in with a conspiracism around feminism that looks similar to some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that we are a little bit more familiar with around the concept of feminists controlling society and pulling the strings. And the founding moderator of the Red Pill went by a couple different usernames, one of which was PK Atheist. The PK reportedly stands for Preacher's Kid. And so the belief system behind the formulation of the red pill was an atheistic one, possibly one influenced by the religious upbringing of the moderator, which may have been a conservative Christian upbringing. But I think that we see that often in the atheist movement, where someone might indicate that they're a skeptic and they've become skeptical of the existence of a God. But if they came from a conservative religious tradition, they have not necessarily approached its views on gender and sexuality and race with the same kind of skepticism. And so they're bringing misogynist baggage and other kinds of baggage into their belief systems in the atheist movement. Whereas someone who becomes an atheist after being raised in a progressive religious tradition is going to bring those progressive social justice oriented values with them as well, even as they change their belief around the existence of God. And because atheists are still such a minority in the country, and so few children are raised atheist from birth, and that it is still a belief that people tend to come to on their own out of religious tradition and realize that they are in fact atheist and do not believe in the existence of gods. Thinking about the different religious backgrounds and the beliefs that they bring with them in that respect is important. And atheism itself, in the end, is a hollow ideology. It's really just the belief that there aren't any gods. And there's not necessarily a set of beliefs that go along with that. But in the movement more generally, there are humanistic beliefs that are social justice oriented that fuel a lot of what occurs in the secular movement. And so personally, I identify as an atheist humanist. I think that it's important to use the term atheist because it continues to be such a stigmatized identity, and not because of the issues that we have with misogyny or racism, which also exist in plenty of religious traditions, but simply because of the lack of belief in God. And so I think that atheist civil rights and identifying as atheist and being out about that and making it easier for other people to be atheists is important. And I think that that needs to be paired with what your belief system is. And the humanist aspect of the label is the one that gets at what is involved in my belief system and my commitments to social justice. And so, in thinking about how we can build the better world that we want to see, we need to confront the misogyny that underlies both religious and secular movements, both the Christian right and groups like the Red Pill, and a variety of misogynistic atheist media personalities that I won't give screen time to mentioning by name. And within the research that I do, which actually began by looking at the Christian right and its attacks in particular on abortion and reproductive justice, and also on LGBTQ rights, I moved on to looking more at these secular misogynist ideologies that were growing in size and were growing as threats. And so in addition to the red pill, which I've mentioned, there's 4 other ideologies that usually receive the most attention as kind of the most significant 5 ideologies within semi-organized misogynist mobilizations we consider. And the other 4 are the men's rights movement, which is probably the oldest of these ideologies and began as a backlash to the 1970s feminist movement. The pickup artist movement, which is very similar to the red pill in teaching game and manipulation and the violation of consent. Then there is misogynist incel ideology, which has developed particularly over the last decade. Incel ideology itself, the term incel goes back to the 1990s and was actually created by a bisexual woman in Toronto and was meant to be an inclusive term, not something that carried the connotations of misogyny and male sexual entitlement that exists today. And now we have male-only misogynist incel community spaces where these senses of grievance and injustice at not having sexual access to women's bodies becomes the core of their ideology, and in some cases has led to manifestations in mass violence and acts intended to spread terror. And the last of the 5 movements is men going their own way. It's maybe what we would consider a male separatist movement. It's the smallest of the movements, and because the concept of men going their own way, or migta, is that men withdraw from society because they share the red pill belief in the conspiracy of feminists running society, see them as using false accusations of sexual harassment and sexual assault as ways to control men, and so men should simply opt out of society already. Because of that choice to opt out, they seem less threatening than some of the other movements which have been associated with acts of physical or sexual violence. But these kinds of separatist and conspiracist ideologies traditionally, for instance, if we're looking within something like white supremacism, do lend themselves to manifestations of violence, and so we don't want to fully overlook them. And so these movements take a few different approaches, mostly rooted in forms of male sexual entitlement and different responses to feeling that it's thwarted. But they're not based on religious ideology, and they are inclusive of religious and atheistic and various kinds of secular and non-religious individuals. And so the idea that I think we sometimes see in the anti-religious elements of the atheist movement, and especially in some of the white male leaders, that ending religion is some kind of magic bullet, just isn't borne out, because we can already see that religion is not necessary to support misogyny, to support racism, to support trans misogyny. And simply focusing on the idea of putting an end to religion doesn't get at the actual change that we need to have a feminist, anti-racist, inclusive society that we would like to build towards. And having mentioned trans misogyny a couple of times, I want to mention what I should have brought up as an explanation in the beginning, that on the whole, the movements that I've discussed as misogynist and other misogynist groups that have become active on the far right, such as the Proud Boys, for them, misogyny and trans misogyny go hand in hand, because the biological essentialism involved in their concepts of misogyny means that they are not willing to accept the existence of trans people. And so these concepts are deeply, deeply interlinked. In thinking of moving forward into this imagined better world that we might be seeking, it requires that we confront misogyny, trans misogyny, racism, and other threats to vulnerable populations and social justice, both in pushing against conservative religious and particularly theocratic movements in which we find these kinds of supremacist thinking, and also where we find our own movement having issues with misogyny and racism, and where we see other atheists who are drawn to and promote male supremacist and white supremacist and cisgender supremacist ideologies. And if we're able to really stand up for social justice within our own movement and as part of how we think about our identity, then that is a really vital part of reaching this feminist and anti-racist society that we are looking to build. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope that this has been an interesting and useful talk.